Okay, it looks like we're live. So a warm welcome to everyone this evening or this morning, wherever you find yourself in the world. I'm aware that there are friends joining us from all around the world for this very special online event at Mind and Life Europe. My name is Johanna Megan. I'm the programs manager at Mind and Life Europe, and I'm joined by a wonderful team here: Gabor Karsai, managing director; Derek Sola, executive assistant; Amy Cohen-Varela, who's the chairperson of our board. And before we get started, and before I introduce our distinguished guest this evening, I'd just like to say a couple words about the Mind Matter series this year, which will be inflected with a new theme, a new thematic focus this year. So this year, as some of you already know, will be devoted in part to what we are calling arts and aesthetics in the enactive fold, where we'll be turning our attention more deliberately to the deeply embedded and embodied affinities between artistic process and praxis and our philosophical and scientific work, which has been grounded in the enactive approach and which was developed by Francisco Varela originally. You will see this inflected in some of our in-person programming, so stay tuned for more news about that coming up at our Summer Research Institute, for example. But also you'll see it inflected in our online programming, and especially in the Mind Matter series, where we hear from some of the world's most prominent researchers, practitioners, and contemplatives. Past guests have included B. Alan Wallace, Mathieu Ricard, Roshi Joan Halifax, Richie Davidson, Stephen Batchelor, and many, many more. This series dates back to 2020, and so if you'd like to have a look at our YouTube page, you can find all of the previous events on that page. And so for a year in which we'll be reflecting on the deep synergy between art, aesthetics, and the enactive approach, we could think of no better voice to open our 2025 online programming than the legendary poet, essayist, and translator, Jane Hirshfield. And so before I introduce Jane, I'd just like to make a note about the format this evening. We will follow a slightly different format than usual. Instead of having a talk followed by a traditional Q&A, we will open with a reading by Jane Hirshfield from her most recent collection, The Asking, New and Selected Poems, and perhaps some other poems as well, which will be followed by an interview and finally an open discussion with everyone present here tonight. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jane Hirshfield. So writing, and I quote, some of the most important poetry in the world today, from the New York Times Magazine, it was quoted, Jane Hirshfield is one of American poetry's central spokespersons for concerns of the biosphere, the values of interconnection, and the alliance of poetry and the sciences. A practitioner of Soto Zen for 50 years, she received lay ordination in 1979 in the lineage of Shunryu Suzuki Roshi. Hirshfield's honors include fellowships from the Guggenheim and Rockefeller Foundations, the Poetry Center Book Award, the California Book Award, and Columbia University's Translation Center Award. In 2024, she received the Zhokung, and maybe I'm pronouncing this wrong, Jane, so you have to correct me later on, perhaps, prize, which is China's premier independently given award for a world poet. And that was given in 2024. Author of the recently published The Asking, New and Selected Poems, 9 previous poetry collections, 2 now classic collections of essays on arts, infrastructure, and craft, 9 Gates and 10 Windows, and 4 books presenting world poets from the deep past. She has presented at festivals and universities worldwide, and her work has been translated into 18 languages. A former chancellor of the Academy of American Poets, she was elected in 2019 into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And I will say on a more personal note that having been a close reader of Jane's work for many, many years, I have yet to encounter a poet in the English language with such an exquisite blend of sensitivity and sharpness and such generosity of spirit as well. And I've just finished today a year-long close reading adventure of The Asking, which is Jane's new and selected poems, which I would encourage everyone to go out and get a copy of. It's available in Europe and also in North America, and also available as an audiobook too, which I recommend. And so just to open before I pass the baton to you, Jane, I once heard you say that poems exist for what cannot be answered, but which still requires a response. And so I think that this evening will be a gesture in that direction. And I'd like everyone to join me in welcoming Jane Hirshfield. And I'd like to give you the floor, Jane. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. And it is just an honor to be asked and a gladness to be asked into this year's conversation being held by this community. So I am going to make it, it's not going to be a talk as usual, but I'll make a few more general comments before I go into poems. I love the title of this year's events themes of relating to the world at hand and to the worlds at hands, the multiplicity of it and the intimacy of it. And when I think about this moment, which is always what, even with earlier poems, one is addressing this very moment. It's all that poems are good for, is speaking into the immediate situation of heart-mind events. I feel like, so the world at hand has always been an alloy of beauty and suffering, radiance and abyss, clarity and ungraspability. There isn't an inch of ground anywhere on this earth that has not been soaked in immeasurable witness of both bloodshed and birth. But there are also times when the urgency becomes for a person more intimate and more visible. We live in particular times and particular places. Some are quieter, some are less quiet. And, that urgency can come to anyone, anywhere, at any time. Life will always present us unanswerable questions. Right now, when one thinks of the life of our species on this particular planet, one might say that urgency could be taking the shape of Ukraine or Gaza or the Congolese Republic or Myanmar. And it grieves me so profoundly to have to say that right now it clearly is living in the country that I speak to you from. I am on the hem of Mount Tamalpais in California on the San Francisco Bay. And, only yesterday, because this urgency takes so many shapes and forms, only yesterday the Supreme Court said to the city of San Francisco, here, yes, it's all right to dump untreated sewage into the bay and into the ocean during big storms. And 3 weeks ago, well, a little more than 3 weeks ago now, but not long, Los Angeles was burning. And these wildfires, the continuous wildfires, out of season, in season, in not only California, but in Australia, in Spain, in the arboreal northern forests, places one never imagined burning. This is also a sign that a crisis we used to feel and speak about as future, as coming, if we don't, we now must speak about in the present tense. It is here. So the work of art in human lives and in human cultures is multiple, like that parentheses S in the series title, and it serves different needs at different times. A lullaby sings an infant from the condition of wakefulness into the terrifying condition and vulnerability of sleep, which is why so many lullabies all over the world speak of incredible peril sung on the voice of the reassuring mother who will see you through. A work song brings multiple beings, wishes, states of life, hands, arms, shoulders, legs, into a unity of power and task. And so I have to, in sadness, say, does a war song. Poetry is a rather neutral technology. It can be used for anything. A psalm, a love poem, and an elegy, these are all rituals of transition. They take a person from one condition of being in the world into another. Art changes perception, it changes perspective, it changes heart rate, and it changes breathing. And if it is good art, I must believe, by my own definition of good art perhaps, it will do this in ways that enlarge rather than narrow, and in ways that honor knowing as recognizably a thing of both body and mind and heart. It will allow the capacities in us for abiding in paradox and uncertainty and incomprehension even to become a window that lets in a different slant of unexpectable light. That is part of what all works of art do. They are always more complex than they might seem. The simplest line drawn by the South African artist William Kentridge has the capacity to move me. There is something about his hand on the page that I am invariably moved, which means it is more than itself. It is telling us more than itself. Art is also paradoxically a kind of strengthening, even as it is a making more vulnerable. These things go together. And for me, particularly all my life, it has been for me a way, whether my own poems or reading the poems of others, a way to find in myself the capacity to say yes to things I would prefer to say no to. We would love to have lives of only joy and pleasure and love that is answered by love, but that is not what we are given. And the saying yes to me has been almost the central task of my existence. Whatever comes, yes, this is what is here, yes. Writing a poem is both for me a witnessing of my relationship to life as it is, not as I wish it to be, but it is also a way of altering my relationship to what is. This is what art works with. This is its palette of materials in the interior way. Is it changes understanding, it changes feeling. And as Johanna has already referred to, for the questions that are answerable, we have science and engineering and instruction manuals and YouTube videos. But I need art, my own, others. I need poems for the questions that can't be answered and still require of me some response. And you find a provisional and momentary answer in the one poem, and then you are going to need to find it again and again, because they are unanswerable and they will continue to be presented to you. So this path of questions has been central for me all my life. I was that way as a child, but this was probably deepened in me because when, as a quite young woman of 21, I first arrived at San Francisco Zen Center, one of the things I heard in my first 2 weeks of practicing in that community was, you should always practice with a question. And Soto Zen is different from Rinzai Zen. Rinzai Zen gives you a curriculum of questions in the koans, but Soto Zen practice, you were supposed to find your own question. And I found one, and I worked with it for many years. And then finally, I felt like, okay, I have come to some answer about this, which I feel satisfied by. And then I had to find a new question. And in recent years, the question has become something very simple and of a different kind, which is the question of, in this life that I call I, the life that lives in my own hands and feet and heart, mind and place and time, how can I serve? That became the practice question. So I've brought you, getting to the poems now, I've brought you a set of poems to read that touch on the themes of mind life this year and the world now at hand in a number of different ways. And for the first one I'm going to read you, it will be a poem that has to do both with the events of recent years politically in this country and with my domestic life and with this business of asking questions. So it gave this whomping big book its title, not from the poem's title, but from the poem's ending. And this is what it looks like in America. Same insides, different cover. And it's a poem that I wrote at what might have been a time that it turns out it wasn't, and I was worried about that even then. So I have the custom of writing a poem every New Year's morning as the first thing I do entering a year to keep my intentions and vow of being a person who writes poems. I'm not a person who writes every day. I can go long periods in silence or in prose writing. And so I do want each New Year's morning to begin that year as a poet. I do a habit that comes out of Japanese both household and temple traditions. By midnight every New Year's Eve, I do an insanely thorough house cleaning. Every ledge, every corner, the pipes that run into the back of your sink gets wiped down and dusted, and the track lights over the stove, all of these things. So that's in the poem. The poem also, it makes a reference to postcards and stamps and other things. That was the 4 years of the first version of our now again current administration. I spent 4 years taking some action every day and continued, and I'm back to it. The day that I wrote this, it was, after the 2016 election, but before the inauguration. And even though January 6th here had not yet happened, you could feel it coming. I will say now, maybe I felt this time coming. I was not reassured. I was not confident. So anyhow, here is the poem, a poem of stock taking. Counting New Year's morning, what powers yet remain to me? The world asks, as it asks daily, and what can you make, can you do to change my deep, broken, fractured? I count this first day of another year, what remains? I have a mountain, a kitchen, 2 hands, can admire with two eyes the mountain, actual, recalcitrant, shuffling its pebbles, sheltering foxes and beetles, can make black-eyed peas and collards, can make from last year's late ripening persimmons a pudding, can climb a step ladder, change the bulb in a track light. For years, I woke each day first to the mountain, then to the question. The feet of the new sufferings followed the feet of the old, and still they surprised. I brought salt, brought oil to the question, brought sweet tea, brought postcards and stamps for years, each day something. Stone did not become apple. War did not become peace. Yet joy still stays joy, sequins stay sequins, words still bespangle, bewilder. Today, I woke without answer. The day answers, unpockets a thought as though from a friend. Don't despair of this falling world. Not yet. Didn't it give you the asking? So yeah, I'm always trying to counter my built in me from childhood propensity to despair. I think for me, part of practice is finding a way to not despair. So the next poem I will read you is a poem that was first published. It was written as a poem of environmental concern, and yet it was published on the day of the first inauguration in 2017 of our current, again, administration. Sorry, I wrote down, I'm looking for the page of it because it wasn't what I wrote down. Okay, there we go. It went wildly viral as a poem of politics. Since then, it returned to being a poem of environmental concern. And when I've been reading it more recently, somebody finally came up to me and said, "Oh, I thought it was about something, a completely other crisis." And we agreed, that person and I, that maybe this is a poem of all-purpose response to crisis. Any crisis will do. Let them not say. Let them not say we did not see it. We saw. Let them not say we did not hear it. We heard. Let them not say they did not taste it. We ate. We trembled. Let them not say it was not spoken, not written. We spoke. We witnessed with voices and hands. Let them not say they did nothing. We did not enough. Let them say, as they must say something, a kerosene beauty, it burned. Let them say we warmed ourselves by it, read by its light, praised, and it burned. That is a poem that hopes to speak itself out of being meaningful. It's a poem imagining the future, looking back on us, and knowing how things turned out. You know, if there is a future, if there are people in 150 or 300 years, they will know how we got through this moment of urgent crisis, what we human beings decided to do. And I dearly hope they will read that poem, if they happen to stumble across it, and say, what was she so worried about? It worked out. But I think the way it works out is by being so worried. So this next poem, again, it is eerie for me, the sense of déjà vu that I live in right now, because 8 years to the day after I wrote this poem, the exact same thing happened. So this was written in 2017 on the 5th day of that then new administration, when the White House took down from its website all references to climate change and instructed every scientist who worked for the federal government not to speak to the public about their work until previously vetted by the political head of their agency. And most of my close friends now are research scientists, and I took this censorship as personally as I would have if it had been directed towards the poets. And by the end of the day, I had written this poem. I sent it to three friends that evening. They asked if they could send it to other people. By a couple of days later, I was getting notes through them from scientists working all over the country. And eventually, well, didn't take long, it turned into my bringing poetry to the big global 2017 March for Science. And I read this on the DC Mall to 40,000 people before that day's march. And it was read in Paris and Marseille and in Dublin by Mary Robinson at the end of that march. So a poem that went quickly to work, and the what I thought was a one-day project turned into an ongoing thing. So Poets for Science, as we called it, continues to be active and work and installed and doing its job. And we will certainly be responding to the current emergency also in some with an event at some point. On the 5th day. On the 5th day, the scientists who studied the rivers were forbidden to speak or to study the rivers. The scientists who studied the air were told not to speak of the air. And the ones who worked for the farmers were silenced, and the ones who worked for the bees. Someone from deep in the Badlands began posting facts. The facts were told not to speak and were taken away. The facts, surprised to be taken, were silent. Now it was only the rivers that spoke of the rivers and only the wind that spoke of its bees, while the unpausing, factual buds of the fruit trees continued to move toward their fruit. The silence spoke loudly of silence, and the rivers kept speaking of rivers, of boulders and air. Bound to gravity, earless and tongueless, the untested rivers kept speaking. Bus drivers, shelf stockers, code writers, machinists, accountants, lab techs, cellists kept speaking. They spoke the 5th day of silence. So I have been writing about the crisis of the biosphere in one way or another for a very long time. And, you know, in 1970, when I was still a teenager, I went to the first Earth Day with its, you know, banners and flags showing the first photograph taken of the whole Earth. And we have known what we needed to know for those 50 plus years. It was available to us then. And it has been, you know, I mentioned in the poem about counting the New Year's Day, being surprised. I never stop being surprised. But as a person of practice, or as perhaps as a person who turned to practice. I do think that all of the ideas and teachings of the Dharma are available to anyone who has heard or not heard that particular version of it. If something were not true for all human beings anywhere, it would not be true for anyone anywhere. And so for me, I just don't like myself very much when I am harshly judging others. And, part of me was stamping my foot, going, how can they? How can anyone who has grandchildren? How can they? And I'm not fond of myself in that condition. It doesn't feel large enough. I spoke of poems as a way of finding a larger view. So in 2004, in a state of foot stamping, I looked for a larger way of seeing this, and I came to a poem which did permanently change my relationship to those who deny what is in front of our eyes to see. And I found it in a story from Robert Hughes's History of Australia. The poem is titled Global Warming. It's very short, it's only 4 lines. Global warming. When his ship first came to Australia, Cook wrote, the natives continued fishing without looking up, unable, it seemed, to fear what was too large to be comprehended. Now, I certainly don't think everyone deserves this particular forgiveness. There are people who comprehend perfectly well and persist in the damage doing. But it helped me to find a way to forgive and to feel compassion rather than simple anger. I'm going to read you next another poem having to do with the crisis of biosphere and environment. It is the darkest poem I have ever written. It frightened me to write this poem. It is called Ghazal for the End of Time. Ghazal is an Urdu Persian poetry form, long-lined couplets with a repeating word throughout. Mine is a loose inhabitants of the form. The word is open, but lots of times I'm using near rhymes to open rather than that particular word. It takes its title, I'm sure most of you have already recognized, from Messiaen's piece Quartet for the End of Time, written when he was a prisoner of war in a camp during the Second World War. I guess that's enough background. Ghazal for the End of Time. Break anything, a window, a pie crust, a glacier. It will break open. A voice cannot speak, cannot sing, without lips, teeth, lamina propria coming open. Some breakage can hardly be named, barely be spoken. Rains stopped, roof said. Fires, forests, cities, cellars peeled open. Tears stopped, eyes said. An unhearable music fell instead from them. A clarinet stripped of its breathing, the cello abandoned. The violin grieving, a hand too long empty held open. The imperial piano, its 89th, 90th, 91st strings unsummoned, unwoken. Watching, listening was like that. The low, wordless humming of being unwoven. Fish vanished, bees vanished, bats whitened, Arctic ice opened. Hands wanted more time. Hands thought we had time, spending time's rivers, its meadows, its mountains, its instruments tuning their silence, its deep mantle broken. Earth stumbled within and outside us. Orca, thistle, kestrel withheld their instruction. Rock said, burning ones, pry your own blindness open. Death said, now I too am orphan. So one antidote to despair for me is agency. Any agency you can find is an antidote to despair. And this is why in the darkest, seemingly most endless abyss circumstances, if you write a poem or make a work of art, you do feel better because you have made something malleable. You have chosen one adjective and not another. You can work with your life if you can write a poem. But another antidote to despair I have turned more and more to in recent years is humility. And I think humility is, not a word you hear much anymore, but for me it connects to the various Buddhist teachings of don't know mind. So Sung Sanim, the Korean Zen teacher, don't know mind. Suzuki Roshi's beginner's mind, which he often demonstrated in speaking with his students. He would often say very mildly to whatever was being brought in, is that so? Or maybe so. Just don't know mind. To not be so sure that we can predict what will happen. Despair is certainty about the worst. And not knowing allows possibility that, anything might happen. So long ago, I wrote a poem called Against Certainty. And when I wrote that, I was thinking very specifically about the ways that people who are sure that they are right will do anything in the service of that rightness. They believe that the ends are worth whatever means. And I hope not. So against certainty. There is something out in the dark that wants to correct us. Each time I think this, it answers that. Answers hard in the heart grammar's strictness. If I then say that, it too is taken away. Between certainty and the real, an ancient enmity. When the cat waits in the path hedge, no cell of her body is not waiting. This is how she is able so completely to disappear. I would like to enter the silence portion as she does, to live amid the great vanishing as a cat must live, one shadow fully at ease inside another. Now, one thing which is endlessly surprising is how much a poet doesn't even know all the meanings in their own poems. So that was what I had in mind when I wrote that poem. But in the last week of the American poet Stanley Kunitz's life, when he was 100 years old, what he had been doing at that stage in his life was saying aloud poems by other people. And his assistant was taping them. And she emailed me. We'd never met. I had met Stanley. We'd done some events together, but it's not like we were close. And he had chosen this poem, Against Certainty. And when she sent me the recording of it, I understood that Stanley was reading it as a poem about entering death. And it's turned out to be the last good day of his life that she recorded this poem. He died 2 days later. And I thought the poem was a greater poem in Stanley's understanding of it than in my reading of it, my writing of it. So another poem on this uncertainty theme is a newer one, even since this book, which is not very old. Last summer, when I was going to, I knew I was going to China for the Zhongkun Prize, which I'm mispronouncing too because I can't do Chinese tones. But Zhongkun is as close as I can get. I was thinking a lot about how, when you go out in public as a poet, sometimes, when there's question and answers, people ask you questions. And I was thinking about everything that was then going on and some of the questions that might have been asked. And what was I going to say? I was trying to think, what could I possibly say? And what happened as a response was this poem came to me. I am asked a question. My life asks me a question. I suggest a better question, one I like more the sound of, with more pleasing grammar. My life humors me. My life asks me that. I don't know an answer. My life is stubborn and clever. My life says, you must choose. I can't choose. I leave the question. I go into the garden and weed. My life weeds with me. The knees of my pants are stained. Another of the themes that I saw in the description of the year's events was embodiment and the body. And so I thought I would read you a poem of the body. I have many, many such poems, but this one ties right into what I've been talking about, so it's the one I chose. A hand. A hand is not 4 fingers and a thumb, nor is it palm and knuckles, not ligaments or the fat's yellow pillow, not tendons, star of the wrist bone, meander of veins. A hand is not the thick thatch of its lines with their infinite dramas, nor what it has written, not on the page, not on the ecstatic body. Nor is the hand its meadows of holding, of shaping, not sponge of rising yeast bread, not rotor pin's smoothness, not ink. The maple's green hands do not cup the proliferant rain. What empties itself falls into a place that is open. A hand turned upward holds only a single transparent question. Unanswerable, humming like bees, it rises, swarms, departs. And of course, another of the theme is science. So I will read you some science poems. I'm going to now start cutting from my list because its time has been moving on, as it has a way of doing. This poem was written in response to a piece that ran in 2013 in the New York Times saying that scientists had discovered how the physiology of how itch works, which had been a mystery until 2013. And I just read this article and I immediately knew, oh, I'm going to do something with that. But you never know, aside from that I was in love with the idea of putting this into a poem, You don't know what that poem is then going to invite into itself. And this one invited in two other things that I can name for you. One is it leads not only from the physiology of itch, but also into the microbiome, which was at that point a newly discovered concept. It's quite well known now, but it wasn't then. But it also allied itself with a series of poems I turned out to be writing, in which I was considering, this question that all Buddhists consider of self. What is the self? It's not that we don't have one, it's like we have this provisional thing that we live inside of in a particular place in a particular time, and yet that is not the only understanding. It is not the only reality. And so my proteins. They have discovered, they say, the protein of itch, natriuretic polypeptide B, and that it travels its own distinct pathway inside my spine, as do pain, pleasure, and heat. A body, it seems, is a highway, a cloverleaf crossing, well built, well traversed, some of me going north, some going south. 90% of my cells, they have discovered, are not my own person. They are other beings inside me. As 96% of my life is not my life. Yet I, they say, am they. My bacteria and yeasts, my father and mother, grandparents, lovers, my drivers talking on cell phones, my subways and bridges, my thieves, my police who chase myself night and day. My proteins, apparently also me, fold the shirts. I find in this crowded metropolis a quiet corner where I build of not me Lego blocks, a bench, pigeons, a sandwich of rye bread, mustard, and cheese. It is me and is not the hunger that makes the sandwich good. It is not me, then is the sandwich. A mystery neither of us can fold, unfold, or consume. Most of you probably know that proteins take their name from the god Proteus, the shape-shifting god, and that's because they work by folding and unfolding, hence the proteins folding the shirts. Okay, I have three more poems, but two of them are longer. Johanna, would you rather I read Entanglement or Time Thinks of Time? For the physics relevant poems.
Wow. Maybe Entanglement.
Okay, Entanglement it would be. So that, of course, takes its title from the physics phenomenon, but because it is what my poems do and most poems do, it's also talking about a couple of lovers who are having an affair from different parts of the world, and they meet at some scientific meeting and onward they go. Okay, Entanglement. A librarian in Calcutta and an entomologist in Prague sign their moon-faced illicit emails ton anglais. No one can explain it. The strange charm between border collie and sheep, leaf and wind, the two distant electrons. There is, too, the matter of a horse race. Each person shouts for his own horse louder, confident in the rising din, past whip, past mud. The horse will hear his own name in his own quickened ear. Desire is different. Desire is the moment before the race is run. Has an electron never refused the invitation to change direction, sent in no knowable envelope with no knowable ring. A story told often. After the lecture, the widow insisting the universe rests on the back of a turtle. And what, the physicist asks, does the turtle rest on? Very clever, young man, she replies, very clever, but it's turtles all the way down. And so a woman in Beijing buys for her love, who practices turtle geometry in Boston, a metal trinket from a night market street stall. On the back of a turtle, at rest on its shell, a turtle. Inside that green painted shell, another, still smaller. This continues for many turtles until finally, too small to see or lift up by its curious preacherly head, a single ungreen electron waits the width of a world for some weightless message sent into the din of existence for it alone. Murmur of all that is claspable, clabberable, clamberable, against all that is not. You are there. I am here. I remember. So I will give you one final poem. I thought I would read you the most recent poem I have written that I'm sure is finished. There's another one almost finished, but I wasn't positive enough. It's still changing with revisions. And, this is a poem of conversation with others, conversation with my own life, conversation also with other poets. The Ossip and Yashin mentioned in it. Ossip is Ossip Mandelstam. He wrote a poem talking about his dust, which was picked up in a poem by the Chinese poet Wang Jiaxin, who came to visit me and admired my table, and all of that turned into this poem, My Dust. I too have borrowed my dust, and soon now must return it, I think. But to who? To what? To Ossip or Jiaxin? A ginkgo? A lake fish? A crane fly? Humility matters, my dust says. Don't try to recall who you were. A time, a language beyond your own skin. I borrow my dust to make coffee. It is almost weightless. I sit at the table. I drink. Table bought at a flea market, table without ambition or lies, standing on 4 strong legs belonging to no one. The table too is dusty, muting its gleam. The world's whirlwinds are distant, almost unheard. The unopened nearby newspaper, nearly unseen. Whose luck do I wear now, I think? Whose hopes this morning? Whose coffee? Whose table do I sit at, made by whose hands? No one deserves their fate. A person opens into a day as if lifting a window. Its motes fall slowly, calmly, like very small spiders or oak trees, whose lives I will never be able to know or imagine. Thank you very much for listening, and over to the rest of the conversation.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jane. If we were in a room together, we would all be applauding you, and probably many of us bowing as well. So really 9 bows to you for this really exquisite overview of your work, and also insight into some of what you're thinking about and how you move through the world. And I think before we move to a more general conversation with the audience in the live Zoom room, which we'll do very soon, I'm actually going to drop the idea of having some time for an interview. So in the
Sorry. Sorry.
no, in the spirit of letting go, I think this will be a nice way to, I just have really one or two questions, and then we'll transition right into the discussion. And I wanted just to bring us back to the title of the evening, which we talked about. We had a long email exchange, and it was really lovely. And we landed on this title, which was partly a quote from you, which was one continuous enactment. Poetry is a way of being in the world. And I think just in the spirit of what you shared and what we've been thinking a lot about this year so far at Mind and Life Europe, we talk a lot about the circulation of knowing and being and doing. So epistemology and ontology and ethics, and all that to say is we're doing this always all the time. And I'm just wondering from your um, from your perspective and your experience, how is it that poetry is a way of knowing and of being and of doing in the world? How would you characterize that, and particularly at this moment?
Yeah. So it is first for me, simply because I am the kind of person and the kind of writer that I am. It is a way of knowing more largely, of expanding, the field of how and what I can know, particularly as I've said, for things that are impossible to know fully. And yet I want to expand my knowledge. A poem I thought about reading and didn't was written back when the Velvet Revolutions were happening in 1989. And my first response was, oh my goodness, huge political change towards, democracy happening without bloodshed. And I was, of course, really happy. But after a while, I felt like my happiness was a superficial response given the history of the world, of that part of the world. And as it turned out, in subsequent years, uh, that lack of bloodshed did not completely last. You had, the breaking up of Yugoslavia, and you had incredible bloodshed, you know, in a place one would never have expected it, which is so relevant now to how I feel about this moment. And I tried to think about it and I couldn't. I just couldn't. Jane, what more? And finally, after a couple of weeks, I said, well, why don't you try writing a poem? And then that's a good idea. That's how I think about things I don't know how to think about. And then I had to figure out okay, how do I start the poem? And I remembered something I'd been told by a painter years before about the painter Bonnard, who revised his paintings. I'm not going to read you the poem. I'm just telling you this story as a process answer to your question. Um, he never stopped revising his paintings. When they were in people's houses, when he went to a dinner party, he'd sneak in, a brush and palette and change the painting. In museums, he changed his paintings. He did this until he died. And so I came to this idea of revision. And what does it mean to revise something? What happens to what was there before? And in oil paintings, over time, they grow more transparent. And you get this palimpsest experience where you can see the first place the soldier's leg was painted, that the painter then changed their mind. And that gave me a way to start thinking about Eastern Europe in 1989, that the past does not vanish. It becomes part of an ongoing, irresolvable present and an unknowable future. And so I ended up writing a poem called History as the Painter Bonnard. So this is, the epistemology of poets has to do with story, with image, with concept, with feeling, and with finding some response you didn't know was in you. I never write a poem because I know something. I write a poem to find something. And so I think of poems and all art as instruments of discovery, instruments of expression, and instruments of what is beyond the self, and our intimate personal lives are part of. Each of us is the instrument that existence plays itself out through. So we ourselves are that, and the poems are the music existence sometimes makes through me. Is that some kind of an answer?
It's beyond an answer. Yeah, it's really I love the way that it's really a process of emergence you're talking about in some sense. And thinking about too, you've often talked about, I've heard so many interviews with you by now that I'm thinking of all of these different questions that have been asked of you about attention and the importance of attention, and both in your poetic practice, but also in your Zen practice. And I wonder if you could just share with us where do you find yourself putting your attention today, and what is that maybe nourishing in you, or what is that challenging in you, and what is that operating in you?
Yeah. So right now, fortunately, all of my attention goes to talking with you. The immediate moment asks us so many questions. A dish in a sink asks for your attention to wash it. But I think you are asking in a slightly less, time immediate way. And, most of my attention, I have to say, has been going to um, the larger circumstances of what has happened in this country, what the voters chose, what is becoming of it. And you know, I feel it continues to be, as I felt, from the moment in 2016 when the choice was first made. What can I do to put my one molecule onto the tiller of the direction of our human lives in this world together? And it remains an unanswerable koan that I just keep having to meet. And there are many realms, directions, and levels in which that happens. I started for the first time I have never done any social media. There is a Facebook page on me, but I don't run it. I am not personally on Facebook. I can't answer a question asked on that thing. But the inauguration day this year, I began posting on Substack because silence did not feel an acceptable option. I didn't do it because I think anyone needs to hear anything I might have to say. There are much, better informed people offering what they have to say on Substack. I did it because it felt wrong to be silent. And, I have no idea how or when I will continue. I've put 5 things on there. A surprising number of people are paying attention. But that's one thing my attention goes to is what is my what is my task in terms of speaking in a way that joins the chorus of all those who are speaking. I will be going on March 7th in this country. We have that's the day of nothing as large as the 2017 March for Science, but it's the day that some young scientists organized Stand Up for Science Days, and I will be joining my research friends in San Francisco, this time just as a body in the crowd, not on the podium. I didn't even offer. I just wanted to go stand with people. I don't have to be on the podium. And so, this is where most of my attention goes, but it's also spring here. My garden needs digging. My garden needs planting. The cat needs feeding. And my own heart mind needs the reminding tuning of meditation, of that condition where you drop the intentions of the day and just are awake to the world. I have found it indispensably helpful to notice beauty, to notice that we go through the world in many ways at any one time. And there is always something beautiful for the eyes to fall on. And there is always something malleable for the hands and the intentions to do.
Thank you. I think with that, we can open it up for a larger discussion with those who are in the Zoom room. We'd love to hear from some of you, so please don't be shy. If you want to just raise your hand, your virtual hand, so we can see you, and then we will put you directly in dialogue with Jane. We have about 25 minutes, so please don't hesitate. I know we've got a lot of long time, probably readers and followers of your work. So this is your chance. And if you can't unmute yourself, feel free to pop it in the chat and we can also read out your question or your reflection from this evening. Yes, Laura, please.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes,
Well,
because I'm just with my mobile phone. Sorry for this. Thank you very much. This really, thank you for your sharing. I'm very moved now, really. Yes. And well, I was thinking that, well, there were some images that were resonating a lot, especially the one that had to do with the hand. If, already in the presentation, you were saying, putting your hand on paper. And then there was also this poem in which there was something like that, this life that is living in your hand, something like that. So my question was more about if you can tell us something about your experience, your embodied experience of writing. So when maybe you sit and you are really there, with your hand, maybe a pen and paper, and what is happening. And because I also loved when you say that this poem comes to you, right? So if you can tell us in this coming of the poem in your hand and getting material in a way, matter in a way. I don't know. So I have this in my mind. Thank you very much.
well, thank you. So for me, when poems come, I do have to be transcribing them because I have a terrible memory. And so I would forget if I don't get them written down. And I do this any way that is available to me. So, I have scraps of paper that I tear in half and use the backs of failed drafts of earlier poems, and I write on those. If all I will write on a computer. I don't really write on my phone, but that's because I'm not very good friends with my cell phone. It's nice to have, but it doesn't live with me. But mostly when poems come to me, what they are coming is through listening. So I listen. I feel before a poem arrives. It's very rare, that process I described with history as a painter, Bonnard, that I looked for a poem. Usually it is simply, I feel in my body a sort of kinesthetic sense that, oh, if I change my attention from doing to receiving, there's something going to arrive. And so I listen, and an inner voice says the poems. And the poems come to me not as ideas. Very rarely, maybe 5 poems in my life, I've had an idea first. But mostly they come as this voice begins to speak. It says, the first line of the first draft. And I am listening and collaborating. So it's a kind of, conscious and unconscious minds, whatever epistemology saying that happens to reflect, but something I don't know is in me has its voice. And that voice knows the way the voice of our dreams knows things that we sometimes need to receive. Some dreams are really bringing us messages we need, not all of them. And so I listen. But then my collaborating mind, what to me the most baffling thing about my process as a poet is sometimes I'm writing, and even though I have no idea what the poem is going to discover, where it's going to go, what it's going to turn out to be, I write down a line and I go, oh, that's a wrong turn. And I cross it out and I listen again. So it is this very intuitive process, which nonetheless comes with all of this very precise language and information. So it is a kind of dreaming through words in which some of the feedback is cognitive, some of the feedback is physical. You know, the emotions are physical. We feel our responses. And sometimes you write something and you immediately feel what you've said and you go, yes, that's going to lead me on to something I need. And sometimes you write it and you go, oh, that's a real narrowing, or that's a mistake, and so I am obeying these many cues from these many directions of the more cognitive, the more physical, the emotional. A poet needs at any moment to write the next word, everything they have ever experienced in their life, everything they know, all the facts, all the stories, the personal life, the shared knowledge of the world. And you just never know what is going to bring you to the next word or to the discovery the poem makes about how to say yes yet again to this bewildering life we lead. So anyhow, for me, silence, listening, and a way to get it down. Those are the indispensable ingredients. And then the entire universe. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Laura, for that great question. Thank you, Jane. Louise, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, hi. I'm sorry, I think the church bell is just started ringing. I live next to a church. Thank you so much, Jane. That was very inspiring and moving. My question is how you decide which poems you decide to keep for yourself or for special someones, or which ones you want to share with the world. And then secondly, if your inspirations to share poems with the world has changed over time.
Yes, lovely question. Thank you. I began as a child only writing for my own eyes and ears. I hid my poems under the mattress. I somehow didn't think my mother would be making the bed and finding them. She probably was, or maybe she wasn't, I don't know. But I began writing as a way to find out who I was, safe from the judgments of others. So it was a field of experimentation. And it is one of the ironies of my life that led me to becoming a public person, one step at a time. So, I wrote my school assignments for school, but I wrote my poems for my own life raft of navigating the world, finding out who I was. And then somehow, very gradually, because it seemed to be what people who wrote poems did, I began, sharing them with other people. And there was, along the line, when I had to start giving poetry readings, I shook. I was not a person who wanted to speak in public. But what seems to have happened gradually was you find out that people appreciate a poem, are helped by a poem. You hear stories of a poem. And it made me a person who began to understand that my poems might have a truly public life. And by the experience of poems written just for me turning out to have public lives, I think I became, to my great shock, a person who felt part of my responsibility as a poet is to respond and to make that public. There is hardly a poem, if I think a poem has worked out, if I think it, turned into a finished poem that is good, I can't remember the last time I wrote such a poem and didn't, publish it. I can remember times when poems were just too private and I didn't, but it's been quite a long time since that. I'm not so revealing autobiographically in my poems. It's not, I don't have the questions that certain memoir writers have about, oh, if I publish this, will it hurt someone's feelings? That's not, my poems are, they always come out of my own life and my own response. But they are not nude portraits, they are x-rays, and so the fear of somebody seeing, a sag here or a revelation there isn't such a big issue for me as a poet as it is for some other writers. So now it's simply, which ones do I share? I share the ones that I think might have something to offer. And if the time comes that I write another personal poem that feels just too personal to put out, no matter how, there's one that's close. Never mind, I'm not going to give it to you. There's one that's close. And when I wrote it and I described it to my friends, they said, oh, well, we'd love to see it. And I said, no. So yeah, it is possible. And I think one just honors one's own sense of, what is for others, what is for me, what would be a betrayal of the self to put out. There are people in the realms of poetry, they don't use the word ethics a great deal, but when I teach, I use that word a lot. For me, there are questions of what is an ethical poem. And that happens on all kinds of levels. There's the ethics of how do you write about the experience of an animal when you don't actually know the experience of an animal? That's an ethical question. There are the ethics of anger and compassion. There are the ethics of what purpose are your poems being used for. And so, but that comes for me now. That isn't an afterwards question. It is a writing the poem question. I hope I've answered to some degree. Thank you. If there's no one else who has a question, I am quite sure that Johanna has some in her satchel.
Oh my, I have about 25, Jane, that's the problem. So I won't keep you until midnight here. If anyone else please has a question, please feel free, either in the chat or don't be shy. Yes, John Kabat-Zinn, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, Jane.
Hi, John. Wonderful to see you here.
Deeply, deeply touched by everything you've offered today. And I wanted to just pursue a little bit the challenges that you articulated and that I'm feeling very much myself about how to meet this moment in our country with the mind-boggling, destructive, ignorant, violent energies that are being unleashed, and to find a voice that actually embodies what we love, as opposed to just reacting and resisting and condemning and othering ourselves, even though the impulse is very much there a lot of the time. And so I just want to bow to you in a sense. I'd love to have you respond however you want to, because I'm very much flailing about how to articulate what feels not ready to be articulated or inadequate or just sort of too mind-numbingly pedestrian, and not really creative or contributive enough at the moment. That it feels to me that we're at a kind of moment on planet Earth, really. I mean, even before this election, where we were in a crisis of all hands on deck because of simply climate change, global warming, and the waking up that humans have developed around our relationship to the entirety of a living planet that we don't really understand, but it's not like it's everything, including the rocks, not just the zooplankton and the phytoplankton and the oceans and the atmosphere. So there's a certain element of the science that's pointing out as never before, and understanding as never before, interconnectedness in the most profound ways that Thich Nhat Hanh and all the Dharma teachers talk about. And then aspirations to actually make something happen, to wake up enough to modulate the climate change trajectory. And then there's the drilled baby drill and the absolute, sort of mind-boggling capitalist enterprise that's oriented towards the billionaires. And so you're challenged to sort of approach this wisely with mindfulness and open-hearted love and compassion. I really think it's asking just the right dose of practice from us, and it's requiring something very difficult. But I feel like I need help in any way I could get it from you, and the poems are an enormous source of help and inspiration. So I want to just bow to you for that and ask if you have any kind of a sense that in a larger way, this sounds outrageous, but that what's going on with the Dharma in the past few generations and how it's actually, in a certain way, flourishing as a kind of renaissance in and of itself in a much more global level, whether you have a sense that that is going to contribute in some way to the possibility, remote as it might be, for Homo sapiens sapiens to wake up, so to speak, to the name we've given ourselves as a species. You know what it means better than anybody, and actually outlaw the kind of greed, hatred, and delusion, however you want to put it, that is driving this kind of thing. And then the lawfulness of Dharma as lawfulness and how we govern ourselves might be possible, but it seems like that's a very rarefied and extremely improbable outcome given human history. So anything that you care to respond along those lines I would be tremendously grateful, because it really feels like it's a moment that's really pregnant with possibilities, many of which are horrifying, but we don't want to give up on ourselves in a certain way and our own genius.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you spoke so long about this, because that, in a way, that is our answer, isn't it? We just keep asking the question in its most full dimensions. So, for me, I felt this. For me, one of the things, as I think I've already said, that is so startling is the déjà vu of it, because the questions that are so pressing now, because everything is indeed so much more out in the open and worse, they are the questions that I met in 2016 when that election happened, and I looked at what I thought was coming. And the answer I came to then about what can I do, what should I do, could I have done anything differently with all my efforts, of a lifelong sense of practice and sense of direction, and the shock of finding out how thoroughly the majority in this country had taken a different path than I thought we would in 1970, when I was so full of hope for understanding Gaia as one shared experience. So in 2016, what I came to was, nothing different, just harder. Just keep doing what you have always done, you must do, but you must do it harder. You must do it more. You must do it with more of your time, more of your intensity. And that was what led me to the one action every day of those years and now. But I think a big question that I wrestle with, and I have no answers, I have only the same questions you do. One question I have had is thinking about Lindisfarne Island, not the Lindisfarne Association, which I was part of for its later years, but Lindisfarne Island. Those monks, the places of refuge for a certain way of feeling the world and for the preservation of certain forms of knowledge, they did matter. And if it turns out that all we can do is create Lindisfarne monasteries of the preservation of compassion, the preservation of kindness, the preservation of understandings of interconnection and acceptance of transience, and the puncturing of narcissism and ego that allow anyone to think that, holding power for a few years is going to turn out to make their life matter or be good. So there's that, what am I doing? If all I'm doing is being a scribe monk in the Lindisfarne monastery of our time, that is not so bad. But if I believe, I have to believe, the optimist in me has to believe that one way cultures change is by a kind of contagion, that if you offer kindness, someone will receive it and feel better and offer kindness a little more themselves. That we do change one another by how we move and walk through this world. And so all I can do and am trying to do out there in the conversations I have with the wider world is inhabit what of the Dharma feels better to me, inhabit it in my poems, inhabit it in how I speak of certain things. I mean, anger is not anyone who doesn't feel outrage at what is now being done to the biosphere and to human beings would be blind, deaf, and dumb. Of course we're going to feel outrage and anger. For me, the practice of working with that is a practice of taking it in as essential information and then going, allowing it to pass and return to compassion, return to what made me write that poem, Global Warming, that I don't care for myself when I'm stamping my foot. I need to stamp my foot first to understand that no, denial is not the answer. But then to have this response of how can I meet this, not by shouting, because shouting is what's doing the damage, not by condemnation and judgment, not by weighing one person's life as mattering more than another's, because that is what creates suffering. So the Bodhisattva vow, even if one, can't hope for every last blade of grass in this lifetime to mend its ways, although the grass, of course, doesn't need to mend its ways, only we humans are the source of the current problems. That vow has to do with what will lessen suffering rather than increase it. That is the question. And for me, a lot of the answer comes in, allowing the anger and outrage to not be, the ruler of what I then return to the earth that gives me so much. but also just, in the poems. So that earlier question Johanna asked about epistemology, I think who we are comes through our poems. And even though my poems are not overtly Buddhist, 50 years of practice is in them. And one of the things which has been in me that probably brought me to practice, because it precedes my entering Zen training, is pronouns. This is the poet's response, okay? The poet's response is pronouns. What do I mean when I say I? What do I mean when I say you? And all my life, from something I wrote when I was 17, what do we mean when we say we? And my feeling of what, since I was 17, since I've said we, is exactly what you were describing earlier. All of it. The rocks are part of my we. The algae are part of my we. The physics are part of my we. And certainly every human being on earth is part of my we. So it's hard for me to say, what Trump is doing, because what we are doing, and that for me has been one of the instruments of remembrance of what feels better and what feels worse and what feels like it will increase suffering and what feels like it will lessen suffering. What are we doing?
Thank you. It's one hell of an entanglement.
It is.
Thank you so much, John, for the question, which I think articulated a question on behalf of many, many, many of us. So thank you so much for bringing us full circle, and for your tender and fierce. I see we have one more hand. We're at the very, very end. So Alvaro, can I ask you if it's a quick question and an urgent question?
Of course. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very lovely to hear you, Jane, and of course, John, everyone here. I feel blessed, absolutely. So, I'm from Peru. I just wanted to say that because I guess I speak in the name of Latino somehow. I'm a fan of haiku, actually, and I wanted to say how much of haiku is there in your poetry. And I just actually brought the question because I was afraid of forgetting. So, how much of haiku is there in your poetry? How much of its principles does your life and poetry embody? How much of its spirit speaks about today's global issues? Because when you were speaking about the we and I actually recall that in haiku, you barely speak about the self. You actually don't use pronouns. So in a way, we are always speaking about the we. And that's what I wanted to say and ask. Hopefully, it helps everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have done a great deal of work with Japanese poetry, including both the form before haiku, the slightly longer 31 syllables instead of 17 form of tanka, but I've also written a big piece about basho and the coming into being of haiku as we know it. I write very few, if any, pure haiku in the form as I know it, but my work is absolutely informed by what my exposure to tanka and haiku gave me. English is a different language than Japanese. Japanese and Chinese, you can easily forego pronouns. English, it is hard to go without pronouns. It's hard to write without pronouns. But the I of my poems is often not the personal I. It's the I of this human being at this moment. So it's a very non-individual I, in that it could be any of us speaking. Basho himself said this marvelous thing to a student. A student uh, uh, brought a poem, and Basho said, the problem with most poems is that they're either subjective or objective. And the student said, don't you mean too subjective or too objective? And Basho said, no. So this is the feeling that haiku carries so profoundly in its means of engaging the world and creating an experience that you can return to, which is what good poems do, is presentational and recreation, so that you who read it feel in yourself what is happening. And the other quality of haiku, which I think is in every good poem, or at least every poem I find good, is they make a discovery. They put one thing, another thing, and when you put them together, there is the kind of spark that happens in the openness of the old technology cars that had spark plugs. And in that gap is discovery. And that is the same experience as happens sometimes in meditation, as happens sometimes in science, in the gap between two things juxtaposed that you hadn't expected to come together, you see and feel something new. And this to me is the heart of all good poetry, is this moment of something new has entered the world. There is a sentence I love by a, not much remembered, but august at one time American writer about literature. He said, good poems expand the available field of reality. And this is what I think we are looking for in our practice, in art, in writing, in our lives, to have an ever larger sense of this precise moment and what it asks of us. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for being in this difficult world together at this moment with the shared intentions of this community. We need one another. And perhaps we will help avert the immediate worst. But if we don't, we will go through it together. We will live through what comes in this moment. Or we will die of what comes in this moment. But it really helps to remember many human beings have been through catastrophes before. And up until now, thus far, the poets have carried the witnessing of it. Art has carried the witnessing of it. And the people of the intentions of what, for lack of a better word, I will call, spiritual understanding, have carried the tools of continuance. I do not want to give up to despair. I want to find something to say yes to in this world, no matter what else is happening, until the moment I step out of this mind-body fate that says yes or says no. And then it will all be easy again. Then I'll just be a bunch of molecules and electrons and not worrying so much. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jane. On behalf of all of us here tonight, and also everyone at Mind and Life Europe, thank you from our heart of hearts. And thank you also for expanding our available field of reality, and also folding us back into kinship. I think that's also somewhere that you took us through your poetry. And on a certain note of hope as well. So thank you so much, Jane, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening and for your wonderful questions. And we hope this will continue. I'm sure it will ripple out in some ways, but we will certainly be feeling it, I know, for weeks and months to come. So thank you again, Jane. And I think we just have a couple of announcements at the very end, as we usually do. Although it feels a bit sacrilege to be giving these very pedestrian announcements after such an evening. These are a few of the upcoming events we have. So we have an upcoming podcast episode coming up next Thursday, which will be released on the 13th of March, which you can read about here. We have an Emily Friends webinar, which will be hosted by Dr. Olga Klemecki, a neuroscientist, speaking on some of the themes, in fact, we touched on this evening, and then a contemplative practice session at the end of March on the 25th, and that's a Tuesday, and that's open for all. So I'd encourage you all to stay in touch and join us online if you can, and of course in person this summer at our Summer Research Institute. And as Jane encouraged us all to keep on and take care of each other and ourselves in these times. So thank you again, everyone, and have a lovely evening or day as it may be.
Thank you, Johanna.
Thank you, Amy. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jane. Let's be in touch and farewell. Take care. Take good care.
You as well. Thank you.